Hi, and welcome back to Real Brewing with Rofaxen. Today we're talking about grains. I like grains. What are grains? Well, honestly, they're what your beer is made out of. You know, you've got wheat beers are made out of wheat. Most beers are made out of, barley or whatever, malted barley. Your grains are really the body. Now, when you taste a beer, you've got a certain bittering factor, that's the hops, and you've got a full body flavor, the real heart of the beer. And that's really what your grains are. And I think really need to play around with grains, experiment with grains, have fun with grains. So today I'm kind of talking about a few different types of grains. I do all grain brewing, which means basically we've got two categories of grains. I'm sure there's an official term. I'm not going to use it because I don't know what it is. You've got your base grains, and you've got your specialty grains, or your flavoring grains, if you will. Now, your base grain is what the majority of your beer is actually going to be made of. Obviously, that's important. A lot of times you'll have 10 pounds of this grain if you're doing an all-grain recipe. For example, I've made up quite a few beers and some really good stouts using a 2-row roll. That is my base grain. The majority of my beer is made out of that. And that will be about 10 pounds. And then maybe there'll be 4 pounds of miscellaneous grains, if that. Maybe only 3 pounds. So the majority of your grain is that base grain. So when you do that, your homebrew store usually has it labeled, these are base grains and these are specialty grains. So when you're buying those base grains, just decide what style you have. They have a different base for an IPA than they would a stout. So kind of look into that. Maybe a Vienna lager would have a different base grain than an IPA. So kind of look into that. Make sure you're using the right base grain for the type of beer that you're actually making. You can usually ask your local homebrew store, what base grain should I be using, and they'll tell you. If not, jump on the internet, do a little bit of research. Usually when they're describing these base grains, they'll say good for imperial stouts and Irish stouts, or they'll say good for Vienna lagers, or they'll say good for IPAs. They'll kind of tell you what you want. Now, that gives you a base for your beer. That's going to make it beer. The specialty grains are really those more complex flavors. A huge part of beer, almost a bigger part of beer in a way. So when you're doing those, you have a lot more freedom. For example, chocolate malt is something that almost all Irish stouts have, or all the ones I've made have. I like chocolate malt, though. Maybe you'll put half a pound of chocolate malt, but that half a pound of chocolate malt makes a huge difference. You wouldn't think half a pound of something would make a big difference, but it makes a huge difference not only in the color, but in the flavor. You really make it darker when you do that. And if you do certain smoked malts, something like a chocolate malt, but maybe something that's been smoked. I once used half a pound of one of these smoked malts, and in 5 gallons. And when I tried my beer, I could totally taste that smoked flavor, and it was a really good flavor. So you really want to use those specialty grains and think about what goes with what would taste good with what. Even if you're making an IPA, you may be able to use a chocolate or a black patent. You're going to have to be really careful if you do that, to be honest with you, because that affects the color, which would make it inappropriate for the style. It affects the flavor, gives it a heavy flavor, which isn't usually what you want for an IPA. I'm saying that's not necessarily against the rules, but it's not necessarily a good idea. But, maybe there's a specialty grain in an IPA and you want to throw it in your stout. That really probably wouldn't be a problem. So some of the things, I'll just go over what I know, which is kind of limited, but to give it that dark, full flavor, use something like a chocolate malt or a black patent. A chocolate malt really is my personal favorite. That really just gives it body and character and flavor. Another thing you have to think about is the mouth feel. You know how it feels on your mouth. Is it crisp? Does it stick to your tongue? All of that stuff. To give it a real full-bodied mouth feel that really feels right for a beer on your tongue. You don't. If you're drinking a beer, you don't want it to feel like water. You want it to feel like a beer on your tongue. And something to give it that mouth feel is a crystal malt. Good place to start if you're like, oh, they've got all these different things of crystal malt. What does this mean? Start with 60L crystal malt. That's a good one. And those L's, I don't even know where that naming convention comes from, but it'll be like 60 degrees L or 120 degrees L. That's just how roasted they are. So 20L is going to be light and 120L is going to be dark. 60L is nice and in the middle, so you might want to use something like that. Alright, so that's a little bit about grains and the different things you can use grains for. Just remember that grains really are the heart of your beer. So this is a really good thing to do, and I know a lot of people don't probably do it. My homebrew store encourages me to do this. Go to the homebrew store. They've got a whole wall of all the different grains. Go to them and taste them. Open the bin up. Take a little piece of grain out. Put it in your mouth. Chew it. Taste it. What do you think of it? I don't know, that kind of sounds weird, but that's really what you have to do. Because if you're chewing on that malt and it tastes good to you, it's going to taste good in your beer too. And that's probably the best way to choose what you're after. A really good reason you would do that is, let's say you're making a beer, and it required a Pilsner malt. There's a Pilsner malt, let's say. So you go to the homebrew and store, and they've got 2 Pilsner malts, and you're like, well, I'm making this recipe, but the recipe just said a Pilsner malt. Which do I use? Try both of them. Which do you like better? And when you get into making your own recipe, instead of just tweaking somebody else's recipe, and that does kind of make it your own, but instead of just tweaking somebody else's recipe, you feel like you want to start from scratch. That's what I did with the recipe. I started from scratch. I went to the store, and I would taste this malt, and I'd be like, I like that flavor. And then I taste this malt, like, it's not so good. And then I knew I wanted mouthfeel. So, and I mean, really, that's all you need. You need, a Crystal 60L and a pound of chocolate, a pound of Crystal 60L and a pound of chocolate. And that's really your basis of your beer. You've really got everything you need there. And of course your base. Let's say it's a 2-row roll. You've got everything you need there, and then you just want to build this and make it more complex. You're like, taste the malt and say, this would go good with what I just tasted, and then put those together in your recipe. This would go good in a stout. This would go good in a lager. This would go good in an IPA, and put those together. Totally personal preference. You'll make a beer that you can't buy in the store, and you'll like it more than what you can buy in the store, more than anything you could buy in the store, because you tasted it all. Alright, so that's basically it. Go to the brew store, taste all these different grains. The ones you like, you use. The ones you don't like, you don't use. Pretty simple. One more thing to touch on before I let you all go. Remember I said the first category was the base malts. Then you had the specialty grains. Well, the base malts actually come in 2 varieties. There is a fully modified and a partially modified and I don't know if that's the right terminology. I do know there's a 2-row and a 6-row, and that's definitely the right terminology. A 2-row and a 6-row. Right, because in the specialty grains you have fully modified, partially modified, and not modified, which deals with their sugar content. And a fully modified, it will ferment just like your base grain would. Partially won't ferment as much, and not modified at all, you're not getting any sugar out of that. But in your base grains you've got a 2-row and a 6-row. And a 2-row is a 1-step or 1 temperature. It's a 1-step mash conversion, which means if you're using 2-row, let's say your recipe, whatever you figure out, you let this, you mix all your grains in the water, and you let them sit there to extract those sugars for an hour at 156 degrees or 165 degrees. That's one step. You just throw all the grains in the water, mix it up, let it sit for 165 degrees, and you're on to the next step. That's what you get when you use a 2-row. When you use a 6-row, it will be different. You'll start by letting it sit for 60 minutes at 145 degrees maybe. I'm just making numbers up. But 145 degrees. And then you increase the temperature of the second step to 165 degrees and let it sit there. It has to do with the different enzymes working at different temperatures. In your 2-row, you've got your enzyme breaking apart the little pieces and the big pieces. Because one of the processes releases the actual sugar, and one of the processes releases the dextrins, which are kind of the things that give beer the flavor that you want it to have. And at the 2-row, they're happening both at once, and at the 6-row, you have to let one process happen, and the other process isn't happening at all. You increase the temperature, which kills the first process and starts the second process. So if you want to keep it a little simpler, and there's all sorts of great grains to use at the 2-row, which is probably the preferred method, that's what I use. Just make sure that you're getting 2-row. If you do decide to go to a 6-row because you tried it and it's just delicious, and you really want to try this 6-row, make sure you look into the 2-step mash conversion. And I think that's all the time I have today. So until next time, get drunk.